And everybody, please give a warm welcome to introduce the event, Ailsa Cox.
And thanks to John Rutter, who's one of the members of the VNR Gee, which is hosting this event today, which is part of the university's Festival of Ideas, which this year takes the spirit of exchange as its theme. And we're very grateful for the funding that we've had from the Institute for Creative Enterprise as part of this year's festival. So, what is the NRG? The NRG is a narrative research group, and NRG is kind of a pun, a bit of an obvious pun. But we're a group of writers based at Edge Hill, some of us staff, some of us former staff like me. I'm an emerita professor of short fiction here. Some of us postgraduates, some of us former postgraduates. There are all sorts of links between us. And when we heard that this was the 30th anniversary of the breaching of the Berlin Wall, we started thinking about an anthology that would explore, in a spirit of exchange, the idea of walls, boundaries, breaking through barriers. So the product is this anthology, Wall, which we're very pleased to be launching today. Afterwards, after the interval, when you've heard the readers from the group, there will be a reading from our very special guest, Chris Power, who we're very pleased to have here, who's one of the authors shortlisted for this year's Edge Hill Prize. So the stories will, I hope, speak for themselves, and here's John to introduce them.
Okay, so our first reader, Carol Fenlon, lives in Lancashire, has been writing short stories, articles and poems for 15 years, many of which have been published in mainstream magazines and small press publications. She's won prizes for her work in literary competitions. Her debut novel, Consider the Lilies, written for her PhD thesis here at Edge Hill, won the Impress Novel Prize in 2007, was published by Impress Books in 2008. She's also a keen local historian, published Skelmersdale, A New Town in Making, Part 1. Triple Death, a short story collection, was published in June 2016, and Plotlands, my favourite, a collection of linked short stories about a rundown seaside shantytown, published in 2016. An autobiography, You Can't, You Won't, written by Gary Skyner, one of the first thalidomide children born in the UK, was published in 2017. Her latest novel Mia, was published in 2018 by Thunderpoint. Carol is on the editorial board of Short Fiction in Theory and Practice and is a founder member of NRG. Give a warm welcome, Carol Fenlon.
Gosh, can't see anyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Right, silence. It's not an injunction, it's the title of the story. It was after I started to work the wrecking ball that things began to change. Before that, people tried to push me around, especially when I signed up for the bricklaying course. Even my mum said, "Viv, what you want to do that for? It's no job for a girl, and then men on building sites, well." She couldn't see it, how I was just too antsy to stick at the bank call centre, where I'd been working since I left school. Everyone at the bank thought I was nuts, leaving a nice clean job for the muck of a building site. Only my best friend Tony understood. She'd worked at the call centre too. That's how we met, but she'd only been there to pay her way through uni. Well, for me, it threatened to be a life sentence. Funny us being friends, because Tony's dead clever. She sailed through her degree and now she's working with abused women. I just scraped through school with a couple of GCSEs. Still, we've stuck together. We mightn't see each other for a while, but one of us will text the other and then we'll start up again. I don't think I'd have applied for the course if Tony hadn't encouraged me. If you want to do something in your life, you've just got to go for it, she said, and I thought, yeah, I guess that's right. But even before I was halfway through, I knew I was on the wrong track. We spent a day on a building site, and we were listening to the site foreman going on about how the trade worked. My attention wasn't on the new buildings going up, but further away where old terraces were still being demolished. When our group went into the site office to see the plans, I sneaked across to the demolition site. I was fascinated by that wrecking ball. The crane's movements were jerky, swinging round like an animal stung on the arse, but the beautiful curve of the ball as it swept the air for the next stroke made me catch my breath. Then there was the cloud of dust rising before the sound hit, and the air rushed out of me just the same, like something had let go inside me. When it settled down, you could see the insides of bedrooms, kitchens, bare to everyone, strips of wallpaper hanging, and I thought about all the lives that had been caught inside those rooms, and it was like they were finally set free to fly out of all that dust and crumbling brick. One room had kittens and ribbons on it. A kid's room, maybe. Another bedroom had big fat pink roses. What did that say? A romantic lived there. Underneath there was bits of older stuff, grey stripes and green leaves. I imagined that woman covering up those boring papers with her roses and her dreams. A bathroom had a mural of swans gliding down a river. There was a castle on the bank. Made me laugh, want to laugh and cry at the same time, set in that dilapidated house in a crummy old terrace. Another swing of the ball and it was gone. When I got back to the group, our tutor was wittering on about the need for new building and good craftsmanship, but as I slipped in among the others, I was thinking, yeah, it's good to build things up, but sometimes it's better to knock them down. The ball swung again in the distance, and faintly I heard that satisfying crash, saw the fall of rotten wood and broken bricks, and it was a release, a real physical release that made my mind up. I gave up on the bricklaying course and took a crane driver's course instead. It wasn't easy getting accepted by the rest of the gang. I think our boss Mickey only took me on for a laugh, so as to give the others a shock, and they got that all right. I know a few of them complained about working with a girl. It made me laugh to hear Mickey telling them he couldn't discriminate, I was qualified and that was that. I could imagine him spreading his hands with an innocent look on his face. They all laughed and one of them said, well, she won't last long. And I thought, that's all you know, mate. They tried the usual stuff, tying rope round the loo while I was in it, sending me to the yard for a long stand, but I didn't let it get to me. When they saw I wasn't going to burst into tears over a broken nail or throw a tantrum if there was no loo roll, they started to ease up. At first they pussyfooted round me, whispered conversations at tea breaks, pregnant silences when I went to the loo, but it wasn't long before they went back to effing and jeffing and making ribald comments about me, and that's when I knew I was in. It was 3 months before they let me on the ball though, and I only got my chance when Jim, the usual wrecker, ran away with his next door neighbour's wife. Working the ball was only one of the jobs I did, but it was my favourite. Every time I swung that ball, the sense of freedom was spectacular, and if anyone bugged me, their face would be on that building as it went down. And if no one had upset me, it'd be my old man's ugly mug, although it had been so long since he'd cleared off and left me and Mam, I could hardly remember what he looked like. I didn't think anyone knew how powerful I felt swinging that ball, but it must have showed. One day we were playing our usual game of lunchtime poker, and I was winning. Pee-wee suggested I might be cheating. No one can win as much as you do. Hairy Arse looked up and said, don't get on the wrong side of her, she'll have your bollocks for breakfast. Everyone laughed, including me. I told Tony about it when we met up that weekend for a drink. She was proper proud of me. I guess it was nice for her after working with all those ground down women, trying to give them back some self-respect. I was happier than I'd ever been. I felt like I belonged somewhere. I was doing something I loved and bringing home a good pay packet to help Mam. And then I met Jude, and suddenly my nights were more important than my days. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. So our next reader, Billy Cowan. You've submitted your entire life story with just a couple of rude bits left out here, so I might have to skip a little bit.
There's more than a couple.
Billy is an award-winning playwright and flash fiction writer. His first play, Smiling Through, won the 2003 Writing Out Award for Best New Gay Play, organised by Finborough Theatre in London, was nominated for Best New Play of the Year in 2003 at the Manchester Evening News Theatre Awards. His play, Caretakers, is a wonderful play. I've forgiven you for the choice of the name for the evil headmistress, Mrs. Rutter. It was on the Stage's Critics' Choice of Best Plays, and at the 2016 Edinburgh Festival. In 2019, Billy's internationally renowned theatre company, Anu Productions, on a... Sorry, worked with... I'm trying to skip this. It was large-scale immersive theatre production for Manchester International Festival. And there are lots and lots of other plays, but I want to mention particularly some of the most recent short stories, because I'm Billy's biggest flash fiction and short stories fan. So his writings appeared in Flash, The Real Story, Ellipsizine, Flash Non-Fiction Funny, and Fictive Dream. His story Big Strong Giant came second in Reflex Fiction's 2019 Spring Competition, and a new creative non-fiction piece about Billy's teenage years and obsession with Prince is forthcoming in Purple Rain, published by, do I say that, Abassi or Abachi Press? Billy Cowan.
Thank you, John, for that unnecessarily long introduction.
I missed quite a bit.
Okay. So this is a flash fiction piece. It's actually the first piece I've written when I started to get back into fiction after a long time away from it. Yeah, so enjoy. Forgive me for all the swear words. Okay, it's called A Good Man. The phone rings. I answer. She's gone, Jimmy. Unable to reply, I replace the receiver and notice a kidney bean from last night's chili lying on the floor. I don't pick it up, but just stand there staring. All I can hear is the tick of the kitchen clock. Then Ollie comes bursting through the back door. What are you standing there like that for? What's wrong? There's a kidney bean. Pick it up then. I bend down as Ollie marches past to the fridge and grabs a can of Stella. He opens it, gulps it back, then throws the can into the bin, grabbing another one from the fridge. I want to ask you something, he says. Am I a good person? The kidney bean in my palm looks like a dead embryo. Well, I've forgotten the question. Jesus, what's wrong with you today? I'm asking a simple question. Do you think I'm a good person? Nice, friendly, considerate, that type of thing. I want to say, I don't really care what you are. My mother has just died, my mother. But I'm not ready to hear the words out loud. Instead, I ask, why? Oh Christ, just forget it, snaps Ollie. Is there anything to eat? He plonks himself down on one of the kitchen chairs and begins to juggle with a kiwi that has been lying in the fruit bowl for weeks. I can tell something has happened at work and that he's going to turn it into a soap opera by revealing the information gradually with dramatic postponements and a big denouement. His tendency towards melodrama is one of the things I loved about him at the beginning, but after 10 years together, it has started to irritate. I'll make an omelette. With cheese, he demands, and none of that blue shit you like. I close my fist around the kidney bean, then drop it into the bin. I struggle to the fridge and take out a block of cheddar, eggs, an onion, and 2 tomatoes. I start chopping the onion when an image of Mother sitting up in bed at St. Anne's, sipping a cup of tea, jumps into my head. She smiles at me. My hand slips and the tip of the knife pierces my index finger. Blood pools on the chopping board. I close my eyes and inhale deeply. Well, don't you want to know what happened today? Ollie asks. It's obvious I'm upset, or don't you care? I look at the knife in my hand. I'm in the bogs, starts Ollie. In one of the cubicles when Joe and Dave come in, laughing and pissing around like 5-year-olds. At first, Joe's going on about what an arse Gemma has and what he'd do to it given half the chance. All the usual hetero bullshit that men with small cocks come out with. And Dave's just agreeing with him like he always does because he's a sycophantic moron with no personality, or looks for that matter. Anyway, I was about to flush the chain and go out and join the banter when Joe says, and I quote, he says, and these are his actual words, he says, "That bummer Ollie is a right pain. Have you ever known anyone to love the sound of his own voice more than him? He's a selfish, egotistical twat." Ollie stalls. Me, an egotistical twat? What about him and his fucking stupid jokes that no one finds funny? He slugs back some beer. And that's not the end of it, he says. Oh no, he starts going about how I never listen to anyone, how having a conversation with me is like speaking to the fucking wall. This coming from Motormouth himself, what a fucking joke. He then accuses me of destroying little Stu in the meeting this morning, saying I spoke over him and destroyed the one chance he had to impress McKay. McKay hates Stu. He calls him a wimp behind his back, for God's sake. Then to top things off, and you'll love this, he said he'd like to smash my gay tanned face in. Ollie pauses dramatically. Well, what do you think of that? She's gone, Jimmy, is all I can think about as tears run down my face. I know I can be a little selfish at times, but who isn't, right? I mean, I'm genuinely interested in other people and what they've got to say. I've always lived my life by the motto, have time for others and they'll have time for you, right? Isn't that right? I turn to face him, wiping my tears away. I'm going to have to tell him, say it out loud. Ollie looks at me. The kitchen clock ticks. Am I getting this omelette or what? He asks. I'm starving. Thank you.
Thanks, Billy. Next author, A.J. Ashworth, is the author of the short story collection Somewhere Else or Even Here, which won Salt Publishing's Scott Prize and was shortlisted for the Edge Hill Prize. She's also the editor of Red Room New Short Stories Inspired by the Brontes, published by Unthanked Books. She's currently studying her PhD here at Edge Hill University, for which she's writing a novel. One Small Thing was first published in the Warwick Review. A.J. Ashworth.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to read from the opening of the story, which is about a metaphorical wall between two people that arises in the aftermath of a devastating incident at a university. One small thing. She is carving dolls for the dead, from lumps of wood that she cuts and pares and smooths into shape. They're all identical except for the names scored and gouged into their bodies from neck to foot, each letter painted in reds and blues. Gjell, Elias, Henrik, Anna, Ingrid. When she's finished, there'll be more than 30 of them. How are you getting on? Asks Thomas behind her at the door to the shed. He sees how the autumn breeze makes the short stray hairs which have fallen from her bun shiver against her neck. She scrapes the knife down a fresh block and a thin peel of wood lifts and curls from the surface before falling to the floor. If she looked down now, she would see how it had joined all the other thin slices there, like pale yellow petals. She would see that she's ankle deep in them. She would see them and want to shake her boots clean. He knows this about her. He knows this much. Okay, she says, without looking up. Thomas steps inside and the door scrapes at the ground, then stutters to a close. He leans over the table, looks at each doll, each name, lifts one up and turns it left to right, right to left. He touches its small bump of a nose with his thumb, but it's so small it's hardly there. Don't, she says, no longer working the wood. Instead, she is watching him, watching the doll in his hand. I just wanted to look, he says. Well, don't. She lowers her head once more, pushing the blade slowly in. Another piece, this time fat as a lip, escapes and falls. Thomas places the doll down, puts his hands in his pockets. He turns from its blank dead eyes and stares instead at the crown of Victoria's head, at the soft pink of her scalp, scar-coloured against the near white of her platinum hair. He wonders about placing a hand to her neck so his thumb can reach towards the swollen rectangle of dressing at the back of her ear. But he pushes his hands deeper into the twin wells of his pockets instead, his fingers finding the loose clumps of fuzz there, rolling them into small hard balls before pushing them deeper into the seams. How long is it going to take? She bangs a block of wood down on the table in front of her. I don't know, Christ. Spit shoots from her mouth and lands on the back of her hand. It's a tiny crystal dome which catches the dull light briefly, then is gone. She puts the blade down more softly. Her head is in her hands, the palms pressed into her eyes, the skin on her face reddens. I just want to be on my own, please. He rolls the toe of his trainer over a crisp of wood, then pushes down until it gives and cracks. Fine, he says, knowing not to touch her now, but instead to leave, across the dry, scratchy, too long grass, back to the house, to the front room and the TV, to find not a news channel, but a film or music videos, and wait for her to come to him, for her to just slip in beside him on the sofa, put her head against his shoulder, just breathe and sleep, breathe and sleep. But she doesn't come then, or even soon after, and it's dusk before he hears the door open and Victoria's boots on the wooden floor. He can already make out the pinpricks of stars through the window, the cratered crescent of the moon scything into the violet sky. He thinks then of the lapscouse and fresh bread he made while waiting for her, how he pummeled and punched the door as he stirred out of the shed, how he listened for her step as he sliced the vegetables and meat before placing them in the pan, leaving it all untouched because he wouldn't eat any of it without her. Everything's still there now where he made it. The bread on the chopping board lying cold and brittle, the stew in the pan buried beneath a thick and wrinkled skin of stock. Thomas turns off the TV and its programme about entropy, that theorised disintegration of everything. He tries not to think of its effect on the world, on everything in it, order slipping to disorder, heat to cold, life to death, how a glass once broken can never jump back into wholeness again. He gets up, shaking his hands to try and shake the crumbling feeling the programme's given him, like being made of sand. He goes towards the sound of Victoria and sees her there in the hallway ahead of him, turning into the kitchen. Some of the hard petals have come in with her and fallen from her boots. They lie abandoned along the skirting or in the dips between the old oak floorboards. There's the smell of the dolls too, in the air she's moved through, the air she's disturbed, the smell of wood dust, of oil paint. Do you want some food, he asks. She's pouring water into a tall, thin glass, the only one of its kind left. The others in the set broke months ago. I'm not hungry, she says, turned towards the window. She gulps down water until the glass is empty, streaks of drops clinging to the sides like trails of rain. Thomas goes to the pan and begins stirring to break up the skin. I can warm it up, he says, and there's bread. She puts the glass down on the worktop. I'm not hungry. She reaches up to touch the dressing. Her fingers hover over it, getting ready to press. He stops stirring. Is that hurting? She turns to him, her eyes glittering in the weak light of a lone spotlight. Can I not do anything anymore without you saying something? Is that it from now on? She bangs the heel of her palm down on the edge of the worktop. Thomas lets the spoon fall against the side of the pan, a dull ting of sound. I'm sorry, he says. I'm just worried. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Next, Elizabeth Baines. Elizabeth's stories have been published widely in anthologies and journals, most recently in Best British Short Stories 2019, the Mechanics Institute Review and Confingo. Two collections, Bouncing on the Edge of the World and Used to Be, are published by Salt, along with the novel Too Many Magpies and reissue of her earlier novel, The Birth Machine. She's also written award-winning drama for Radio 4 and has written, produced and performed her own work for Fringe Theatre. Home is an extract from a new novel, Astral Travel, which will be published by Salt in 2020. She's taught fiction at Bolton Institute and the University of Manchester. Elizabeth Baines.
Well, although this piece is an extract, it is actually also a proper short story because it's told by a character in the novel. She tells it to one of the other characters. And I've called it Home for the anthology. It doesn't have a name in the book. First of all, I need to change my specs so I can see it. Sorry. Right. Home. This is the story the old woman told me. She was newly married. She and her husband had just moved into the cottage. She was 26 years old. She was alone on a hot summer evening cooking at the range when she heard a strange sound. Like a bird, but not any bird she knew, and she knew them all. A clear, mellow, haunting sound coming from just outside the door. Like a signal. She stood stock still. She wiped her hands on her pinny and crept quietly to the door. She eased it open. The sound stopped. She could see nothing. She stared at the garden wall where she thought the sound had been coming from. Nothing but lichen baking in the sun. A beige flicker on the wall caught her eye, which she thought at first must be a lizard. It came into focus. A huge cricket, the biggest she'd ever seen, poised on top of the wall. It seemed to watch her a moment, and then turned and hopped away down into the road. She guessed where it had come from. The next cottage up the hill. Her cousin had been living there with his wife and 2 children, but 2 months before his wife had died of consumption, and just 2 days ago he'd moved out, unable to bear being there alone. They'd always been plagued by crickets living in the warmth behind their stove, but for 2 days now the stove had been cold. Next morning she knew that the cricket's song had indeed been a signal, but not to her. Overnight the crickets had moved out too, poured down the hill, over the wall, under her door and through cracks she didn't know they had, and taken up residence behind the range. And that was it. After that, they were always there. You couldn't hang up anything made of silk to dry by the fire. They'd eat it right through. A curse, they always called them. But she said she remembered the stillness of the air that day. That lone, defiant cricket watching and waiting. And that beautiful song. A song of hope and salvation. And she thought of it as a blessing.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth Baines. Our next author, Dr. Philippa Holloway, otherwise known as Doc, Doctor, or any other derivation of Doctor. A short fiction writer published in the US, Australia, Africa, Europe and the UK in various publications including Ascent, Buckatillable, never heard of it, New Contrast, Litero and with Nightjar Press. She's won prizes and literary awards including the Fish Publishing Prize, the Scythe Prize. Her short memoir Energy Crisis was highly commended in the inaugural New Welsh Writing Awards, and from this she was commissioned to create a special feature for the New Welsh Reader on artistic responses to nuclear power stations and landscapes entitled Power in the Land. She visited Chernobyl's exclusion zone as research for her PhD, which she completed. She's a doctor now, did I mention that? She's a writer-in-residence at Hack Green Nuclear Bunker. She's taught creative writing at Edge Hill University since 2015, previously taught writing workshops for the mental health charity Mind, has led interactive writing sessions at literary and arts festivals, and was the Hedge Arts Short Fiction Competition judge in 2018. She's a member of Liverpool University's Literature and Science Research Hub and has been invited to contribute to the Material Cultures of Energy Research Group and most recently the Cognitive Sensations Project. And she's a doctor. Dr. Philippa Holloway.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. And in case anyone's not sure, I will never get tired of hearing that. Okay, I'm going to read my short story, Handprints, now. A knock, hard and authoritative. One that makes her heart echo its weight and urgency before she even gets to the door. This is not the friendly knock of her neighbours reminding her to put out the bins, or of the postman bringing far-travelled packages from her mother. This is a knock that says danger in 5 sharp, hard beats. She feels it in her ribcage as she walks down the hallway, speeding up when she sees 2 black and white shapes behind the glass.
At first she thinks it's the police, tries to work out what might have happened. Another burglary on the street, a murder like the one on the news last week at the far end of town. If so, she can tell them she has seen and heard nothing with a clear conscience, because she only leaves the house to go to work, the shops, or to do the school run, and keeps her eyes down when she does. She grabs her headscarf from the banisters and wraps it hastily around her hair and shoulders, opens the door a crack, sees two men, wide as sofas, side by side. They have radios, white shirts and black ties under body armour. Paperwork. Behind them, the morning street is bright with sunshine, red brick terraces, small front gardens, parked cars. Two women, neighbours on the opposite side of the road, stand smoking, only half pretending they aren't watching. A teenager slides by on a bike. Samira Panahi? She nods, reaching out to steady herself on the wall as fear weakens her legs, realising too late that she should have expected this, despite the reassurances from the council. My name is Tony Yates. I'm a High Court enforcement officer. His foot is on the threshold. There is a camera on his chest, its glass eye watching her. She waits. I have a writ of possession order, which means I'm here to evict you for non-payment of rent. You need to leave the property immediately. She nods again, determined to retain her dignity, but her throat feels like it is wadded with old clothes and soft toys, and she can't form a reply. Can we come in? He asks, not waiting for an answer. A neat beard trimmed to hide a bulbous throat. She can smell him as he passes. Sweat, deodorant, coffee. His colleague follows, shirt rustling. She shuts the door on the eyes of the neighbours, imagines they will still be there when she opens it next. The men find the kitchen, and the room seems smaller with them filling the space. Samira is suddenly aware of the clutter, dishes in the sink, laundry spilling from the basket by the washing machine, walls pasted with pictures and photos. She's lived here nearly 10 years, and it shows. Her cheeks burn. Since her husband left, there has never been a man inside her home. They lean against the worktops, taking control of the space. It is half-term, midweek. Her daughter is sitting at the kitchen table, pens and papers spread out between the lunch plates. Halfway through a drawing of a castle for her homework, she places the felt tip down carefully, watches these two huge men with blank-eyed passivity. This is a skill she has honed at school. Silence in the face of threat, words bruising her on the inside while her face stays still. I have nowhere to go, Samira says. Hears the pitch of her voice waver, leans on the back of a chair. You should have received a letter, at least a fortnight ago, telling you that you were being evicted. My children are here. Where can we go? A wail from the other room. Her son is not quiet, the opposite of her daughter. This boy shares his feelings in abundance, sobs at bedtime, screams at the smallest injustice, the wrong cereal, a loose button, a glance. How old are your children? The second man asks. He is older, crinkled eyes behind glasses. His voice is soft. 9 and 5. She goes to the living room, scoops up her skinny son and carries him back into the kitchen. At the sight of the men, his cry crescendos. He buries his face in her hair and clutches her shoulders. Have you been to the council? Did they say they would help? I did have a letter, and I did go to the council. They said they cannot give me a home because I have a home. They said that I could not be evicted because of the children. Her daughter is watching her, assessing. Samira worries for this girl, the way she absorbs harm, as if she already knows there is no point fighting back, resisting. She is like a vessel into which other people will pour their troubles. She will fill up until she herself cracks. She sits at the table completely still while the enforcement officers explain. I'm afraid that's not true, the older man with glasses says. This eviction notice was issued by the High Court. You have to leave today. Do you have somewhere to go? Family? No family, not here. My husband is gone. I've lived here for many years, always paid rent on time until my hours were cut. What is your job, Mrs. Panahi? I work in a care home, in the kitchen. They changed my hours, so now I am looking for something else. I worked there for many years. I paid my rent, always on time. And they won't increase your hours again. They say no, unless I do shifts. I cannot work evenings. She glances at her children. The holidays are hard enough. Do you have a social worker? Yes. And they're helping you? No. They say I don't qualify. I work for 6 hours a week, and they say that means I'm not entitled to emergency money. But I can't pay rent and feed them. I will when I have a better job. I'm looking, but I need to feed them first. The men look at one another. She sees the pity in their eyes, and it burns her stomach. We need to stay here. This is our home. But it's not your house. I'll leave it there, and you can grab a free copy to find out what happened.
Nicely read, Doctor. And last but very definitely not least, Ailsa Cox is a widely published short story writer whose work has appeared in magazines and anthologies, including Best British Short Stories 2014, The End by Unthanked Books, Litro, The Mechanics Institute's Review, and Confingo. Her collection, The Real Louise, was published by Headland in 2009. Other books include Writing Short Stories, which all you students must read, which was published by Routledge in 2016, 2005 and reprinted in 2016. Alice Munro, and she continues to publish essays on Munro and about other short story writers, including Catherine Mansfield, Helen Simpson, Daisy Johnson and John McGregor. She's Professor Emerita at Edge Hill University, where she founded the Edge Hill Prize, the most important literary prize in the UK to reward excellence in published short story collections. She also edits the peer-reviewed journal Short Fiction in Theory and Practice, and is Deputy Chair of the European Network for Short Fiction Research.
Thank you, John. This story is told with a collective, indeterminate, sort of free-floating voice, so I thought I'd better warn you about that before I read the extract. It was written especially for this anthology, and there are two writers who aren't in the anthology but are Edge Hill writers, because there are a lot of writers around Edge Hill, and I particularly want to thank them for unwittingly stimulating some of the elements in the story. And those writers are Julia Clayton and Claire Dean. So it's called Wall. Our town's famous for its wall. By famous we mean locally, though some of you might remember Centurion biscuits, a bit like Time Out or the Echo Bar. They're always coming up on lists of most missed childhood treats. A whiff of spices used to drift from the factory that now stands derelict, its windows smashed and yellow warning signs tacked to its vacant shell. In the city, a handsome old building like that would have been converted into flats. But there are no takers in this town. No one moves here by choice, and those of us who are born here leave at the first opportunity. The wall's nothing much to look at, a sandy-coloured ridge, no higher than a garden rockery. There have been one or two archaeological digs. You used to be able to see the black and white photos in the library, but excavations tend to concentrate on the bigger sites, York, Chester and Bath. All the same, we're proud of our wall, even those of us who've forgotten why we get a haircut at Julius Scissors and buy our chips at the Colosseum Fish Bar. The legend goes that Boudicca took her last stand close by, and that her bones are buried not too far from this spot, and that those of us with flaming red hair, might even be descended from the rebel tribes. Not everyone sides with the losers. Some historians dismiss all those tales about Boudicca rising to revenge her daughter's rapes as Celtic propaganda. According to them, it all came down to hard cash. Boudicca's husband had signed over half his lands to Nero in return for a handout. And when he died, she reneged on the agreement. The Romans were perfectly within their rights, and the only source for the rapes is Tacitus, who was 4 years old at the time. When the local paper was still going, that was a controversial issue, a good standby when there was nothing much happening, or a distraction when the news was bad, like the biscuit factory closing, or that poor girl they found in the canal, Sandra Hedges she was called. You remember. They never found who did it. You remember Sandra Hedges. Her name was everywhere. Or maybe this is Sandra Hedges, staying on the A5, She's not sure why the A5 that used to be Watling Street, on this unusually sunny day in February, when the verges are awash with snowdrops and crocuses are sprouting like bright lollipops. Sandra Hedges has a different surname now. She runs an antique shop, Antiques and Vintage, in a quaint town on the Welsh border. This morning she's been in pursuit of a Victorian whatnot in Cannock that she might have known would turn out to be a reproduction. And perhaps it's for this reason, not wanting a wasted journey, or just because the first open skies of spring have tempted her to press on towards a new horizon, even if it is in fact just a tiny detour into her hometown. Circling the one-way system that seems to deliberately swat the driver back towards the motorway, she already regrets the spur-of-the-moment decision. But here she is, having penetrated beyond the retail park, the multiplex, the football ground, parking by St Chad's, built, as she well knows, on the site of an ancient temple. The lich gate, like a wishing well, is the one in her parents' wedding photographs, and those from her own first marriage. The first daffodils have opened early in the churchyard, and the branches of the weeping willow are phosphorescent in the sunlight. The doors are closed, the porch gates padlocked, but that doesn't matter. The church isn't what she's come to see. What she's come to see is the wall beyond the church next to the playground where she used to take her kids when they came back to visit their grandma. How often has she dreamed the landscapes of her childhood? The avenues and cul-de-sacs of the estate, the brambles and the cinder path at its border, and the wall protected by iron railings that seemed impossibly tall and sharp like the massed spears of Roman legionaries. False dreams, or else this is a dream. The landscape's out of kilter. Something to do with proportion and scale. But that's not all. There's something else, as if she's seeing it through the wrong glasses, and she fails to locate the wall, even though she knows exactly where it ought to be. That's enough for now. Does she ever find the wall? Discover here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ailsa, and that's a very nice point to end. There are copies of the book outside.
And I'd like to introduce Chris Power. And Chris is a great short story expert. He's the author of the Brief Survey of the Short Story in The Guardian, which is absolutely indispensable to anyone wanting to know anything about short story writers. And he was an obvious choice to be a judge for the Edgehill Prize a few years ago. And it came as no surprise to learn that he was at work on his own collection of short stories, which is Mothers, which is shortlisted for this year's Edgehill Prize. So I'm not going to say any more. I'm just going to introduce Chris Power.
Hello, thank you. Thanks to Edgehill for having me, and to the VNR Gee. Thanks for those readings, which I loved. I was saying Billy was kind enough to finish his, but everyone else has left us in a state of suspension and anxiety, which short stories are pretty good for, actually. It's one of the things I love about them. I also asked me to think about walls in terms of this reading, and I was happy that I'd already selected something that I wanted to read from Mothers. So I was relieved when I went back to it and found 2 walls in it, maybe even 3, I'm not sure, but certainly there's quite a dramatic act that occurs by one wall. It's interesting because there's a sort of wall of opinion as well. This might be a bit self-regarding to quote my own reviews, but this story was simultaneously called One of the Jewels of the Collection by one reviewer, and the collection's only misstep by another reviewer. So I'll let you I'll let you decide which side of that wall you want to be on. But it's actually helpful for my state of mind this week, given that the Edge Hill Prize is on Friday, to sort of remind myself of subjectivity and chance when it comes to art. And chance occurred on the train on the way up, actually. I happened to glance out of the window, which I wasn't doing most of the time, and I saw the ruins of Berkhamsted Castle just as I looked out, which is this Motte and Bailey fort outside Berkhamsted. And most of it's ruined, but you can see quite clearly the walls still. I guess walls that were uncovered by architects, which taught us about archaeologists, not architects. There hasn't been some architecture done that for a long time, judging by the state of it. It's taught us about a past way of life. And it was an additional coincidence, because this story that I'm going to read from is called The Colossus of Rhodes, but for a long time when I first wrote it, it was called Crossbows and Catapults, which was a very 80s game where you'd sort of throw plastic pellets at your opponent's castle from crossbows and ballistas and try and fracture the walls and bring it down. But you're not going to hear about crossbows and catapults because I've sort of filleted out parts of the story. So I'm going to read a bit of the beginning, a bit of the middle, and a chunk of the end. So it's actually 50% of the story. So if any of it doesn't make sense, just think of your view being obscured by the wall I've erected between what I've cut and what I've kept. The Colossus of Rhodes. My family has come to Kefalonia. My daughters, 4 and 2, have never had a beach holiday before. Mostly we go to Sweden to visit my wife's family. This year, though, is different. This year, my wife said, sun, a guaranteed week of it. And so here we are, lying on sun loungers and running into the water and out of the water and turning brown by degrees. It's my first time back in Greece since I was 10, when my family went to Rhodes. On the second day of the holiday, my mum, my brothers and I got stuck in the small hotel lift. We were only a couple of feet above the 3rd floor and tried forcing the doors, but we couldn't get them more than a few inches apart. Help, we called, but no one answered. Don't worry, my mum said. Your dad will work out where we are. Frank and Dominic were excited, making jokes about running out of air and saying they'd climb out through the roof. They knew how, they said, because they'd seen it in a film. The lift was hot. I stared at a strand of my mum's red hair that was stuck in a curl on her forehead. I thought about there being nothing below us but empty space and how the wire we were hanging from might fray and snap. I concentrated on not crying. My brothers would call me a baby if I cried. My mum had found her phrase book. Boethiah, she said. That's help in Greek. Boethiah. Boethiah, we repeated uncertainly. That's right, very good, she said. She spoke the word more loudly. She pitched her voice very high and sort of sang it in the voice she used to call our cat. Boethiah, she said. Boethiah. Just when I felt sure we would be left to hang there forever, voices came back, faint but distinct. Mum smiled at me and puffed some air up out of her mouth in relief, freeing the stuck curl. She called out loudly, Boethiah! We all joined in, and the lift rang with the word, Boethiah! The voices answered again, this time from just beyond the lift doors. No, one of them said kindly. No, Boethiah. I remember a morning spent wandering around Mandraki Harbour. Standing on the harbour wall, Dad pointed out some brown smudges above the blue horizon. Turkey, he said. The harbour was where the Colossus of Rhodes had once stood, one of the 7 wonders of the world. The guidebook said it couldn't have really stood astride this harbour the way so many paintings show. Its weight would have been too great. But everywhere we went, I saw postcards of it with 1 foot on each wall, and anyone walking out into the mouth of the harbour couldn't help but stare across from one stone pier to the other and think, this is where it was. I stood there and saw it rising 100 feet above me, the same emerald green as the Jolly Green Giant, naked except for a loincloth. It faced the sea, a bow and quiver on its back, and one arm raised and holding a burning torch. I imagined myself aboard a merchant ship sailing between the Colossus's legs. We sailors craned our heads as the sun disappeared, and we entered into the lake of shadow beneath the vast statue. The noises of the busy harbour, the slap of waves against the boat's hull, and the cries of birds overlapped and echoed. A chill haze of salt spray hung in the air. I imagined the sloping foot of the Colossus beside me on the harbour wall, its toenails big as turtle shells. It collapsed in an earthquake, the story goes, and lay rusting for hundreds of years, and when it was sold for scrap, it took 1,000 camels to take it all away. I remember a couple of other things. Not other things, the main thing. I was in a cafe playing an arcade game. My brothers, I think, had gone back to the hotel. Mum and Dad, I think, were in a neighbouring shop buying crockery. They bought me a Coke and gave me a stack of coins for the game. I'm not sure that's how it was, and it seems strange that I would have been left alone, but I had to have been alone, or at least distant enough from everyone that I felt alone. And the game I was playing was definitely Asteroids, because I remember it was a game I never liked. I always struggled to correct for the inertia that dragged my ship where I didn't want to go. I was sitting on a bar stool, my Coke on a table behind me. The arcade game was beside the window, through which I saw a car park, and beyond it the smooth water of the harbour. The bright sun made it difficult to see the screen. The heat made my thighs stick to the leather seat, and a crack in the cushion pinched my skin as I squirmed in unison with the chaotic movements of my ship. A man came and stood close beside me. Right away it felt strange, this closeness. He said something I didn't understand, and I turned to look up at him. He had a kind face, pudgy and tanned. His hair was black and lay in curls at his collar. He smiled down at me, and I smiled back. My palms prickled. I crashed into another asteroid. I looked down at the man's loose trousers, his sandals, his feet. There were spots of white paint on his toes. He spoke again and put his hand on my leg just above the knee. I looked at the screen and saw my ship spinning. I looked around and saw the owner of the place standing behind the counter reading a newspaper. A woman sat at a table, staring at her plate as she chewed her food. Voices gabbled from a radio. The man lifted his hand and placed it halfway up my thigh. He murmured something that sounded like encouragement and gestured at the screen with his free hand, while the other kneaded my thigh. He had a friendly smile. I continued to smile, not knowing what else to do. When I looked back at the screen, several asteroids were closing in. My hands were frozen. My ship shattered into 3 lines that floated apart and slowly faded into the black. The man's hand, heavy on my thigh, moved slightly, and he exhaled through his nose. I felt that warm, expelled air run across my cheek and down my neck. I felt his fingers flex, and one of them came to rest against the tip of my penis. Game over, the screen said. I spun the ball as his finger began to roll backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. I pressed my hand against the game cabinet, kicked back my stool and ran to the door. It was locked, and as I pushed helplessly against it, I could hear the other people in the cafe moving quickly towards me. The air grew thicker, hotter. I yanked, and the door opened. I had pushed when I needed to pull. I turned and saw the man still standing beside the arcade machine, the woman still staring at her plate. At the counter, the owner looked up from his paper and towards me at the door with weary curiosity. "Goodbye," I shouted at all of them and ran outside. Nora has sunburn. It's my fault. We fell asleep together on a sun lounger, and the sun swung around, and now her foot has a stripe, red as a ribbon, running across the heel. She cried and cried. I couldn't sleep at all the night after it happened. For a while, silently and ridiculously, I blamed my wife for wanting this holiday in the sun. Now we make a thing of moisturising the burn. "Foot drinking," my daughter says, watching carefully as I rub in as gently as possible the chill white liquid. "It's so cold," Nora says, looking at me, her eyes widened in a rehearsed and pleasurable surprise. She wears her socks on the beach, only taking them off when she goes into the sea. When we are back in London, her skin will peel, revealing the next layer, and before long we, won't even remember the pain she suffered. Ipperton Street, the street of the knights, ran down towards the harbour between buildings of biscuit-coloured stone. In the late afternoon, a diagonal stripe of shadow divided the street. I pretended the sun was lethal. Stepping outside the shadow meant death. The street was busy with tourists leaving the old town and heading to the harbour for sunset. Absorbed in my game, I didn't realise how far I had dropped behind my family. Halfway down the street, almost hidden in the shadow of an alcove, I saw a cat curled into a circle. As I approached, it lifted its head, its eyes opened to slits, and let out a quavering meow. It was very thin, and its black and white fur was matted with dirt. Crouching down beside it, I saw a deep wound on its neck. It had a thick, pale yellow goo around its eyes. It was obviously dying. Tentatively, I reached out to stroke its back. Its fur was sticky with dirt. Very slowly, as if immensely tired, it moved its head back over its shoulder, feebly seeking my hand. I stood and looked around. Crowds of people were passing, but no one was paying any attention to me. I scuffed my leg backwards and forwards a couple of times. The sole of my trainer whispered against the smooth stone of the pavement. I swung my leg again, harder, and felt the faintest resistance as my foot brushed against the cat's head. It made another small pleading sound. I can help, I thought. I swung my leg again, then rested my palms against the wall and shut my eyes and kicked as hard as I could. I heard a crunch, like a Coke can being flattened. I opened my eyes to look, then turned to face the street. The crowds walked on, oblivious. My family went on holiday to Rhodes in 1985, more than 30 years ago. There were many times when I thought about telling my parents what happened, but I never did. The more time that passed, the less certain I became that I should tell them. And now I've written this, it already seems more real than whatever actually happened. Even though there's so much I left out, like Costas, our waiter at Top 13, the restaurant we went to, as I remember it, every single night of the holiday. My middle brother, a gifted caricaturist, drew a picture of Costas and gave it to him as a present. In the picture, he was lifting his arms heroically, carrying 3 huge trays loaded with food, while bikini-clad women clung to his legs. He gave us his pen, a cheap plastic biro with the name of the restaurant printed on it in golden block capitals. It was a prized possession at first, one my brothers and I fought over. But sooner or later, it lost its allure and became just another pen in a pot. We met an American woman called Nancy on an excursion to a ruined temple or a ruined fort, I forget which. She was a teacher and was living in London for a year on an exchange program. We stayed in touch, and 5 years later, the whole family travelled to Corvallis, Oregon to visit her. A few years after that, when I was travelling around the US, her daughter Carla put me up in New York. But there isn't room for any of them here. Stories need everything extraneous to be stripped away, and Nancy and Costas, let alone Carla, are extraneous. So are my brothers, who are barely present at all. I probably should have left them out altogether, but I couldn't bring myself to. Plus, my being an only child would have raised other questions like, why did his parents leave him alone in the cafe? Which is a good question anyway. I can't remember where they were when I encountered that man. I find it hard to believe they weren't there, around a corner maybe. I remember the arcade game being in a sequestered space, the kind of side room where you might find a pool table tucked away or air hockey. When I tried writing it like that though, with them so close by, it seemed implausible. Other than that, what I describe is faithful to my memory of the event. It would have been more dramatic if the guy had started masturbating himself like the tramp in the Joyce story, but he didn't. What I didn't do is kill a cat, but I did see a cat get killed. It really was on Ipperton Street, and I might well have been playing with that game with the son. I used to do stuff like that all the time. I saw this kitten curled against the wall. It's a cat in the story because a kitten would be too much. It was dirty and sick, and as I was stroking it, a group of Greek kids surrounded me. The leader, a boy maybe a year or two older than me, started shouting. I didn't understand what he was saying, but he was obviously angry. He pushed me down on the ground and kicked the kitten 2 or 3 times until it was dead. And I shut my penis in my zip. Another thing I never told my family. We were going to dinner. Dad and my brothers were already downstairs in the lobby, and Mum was waiting for me just outside the toilet door. She wasn't hurrying me, but I felt like I was keeping everyone waiting. I shook off quickly and yanked up the zip of my trousers, too quickly. I won't try and describe the pain. It's enough to say I looked down and saw these angry pink bubbles of flesh squeezed between the zip's teeth. I tried writing about stifling my tears, about wadding toilet paper into my pants, about the scar I was left with, but I scrapped it. Boy gets felt up, sees kitten being kicked to death, then rips penis up in zip. What's anyone meant to do with a story like that? The funny thing is, the scar on my penis, a line of raised caramel-coloured skin as thin as a credit card, is the only tangible evidence I have of anything that happened in Rhodes. The sunglasses broke and were thrown away. I lost the sweatband, and Crossbows and Catapults was exiled to a cupboard shelf before being donated to a jumble sale, along with boxes of other once prized possessions. Maybe it's because I never spoke about these things to anyone that I find it so difficult to shape them into a story now. And if I can't do that, what are the chances anyone else will? When, if my parents and brothers hear about the man or the cat or my penis, it will only confuse them. Are you sure it really happened that way? They'll say. Can it have been like that? It's understandable. It was 30 years ago, and even if what I've described were objectively true, what does it mean if no one else knows about it? And what will change if people do know? What difference does writing about it make? Maybe it's easier to say, I made it all up. But when I look at my daughters, squatting on the sand, burying their toys and making little streets and houses with shells, I can't help but wonder, if the same thing happened to them, would I want to know? And if I knew, what then? Would I find the man who did it, report him, beat him, kill him? I've rarely spoken to anyone about what happened on Rhodes, but not so long ago, when I started thinking about this story, I described it to a lawyer I met at a party, and she laughed and said, "And that happened to you once? That happens to girls hundreds of times. After a while, it's not even news." Can that really be true? I tell myself it can't. Of course it can't. Saying something doesn't make it true, nor does silence strip the truth of its authority. I know what happened to me, and that I won't let it happen to these girls I can still enfold in my arms and who jiggle their feet on my thighs. It's impossible to say they will always be safe, but sometimes it can feel like the truth. The same way that when you stand at the mouth of Mandrake Harbour, you can see the Colossus soaring above you. I tell the girls about the statue that was the biggest the earth had seen, that took 12 years to build, and that one day fell, and 1,000 camels came to take it all away. "Is it true, Dad?" Sonia asks. "Did it really happen like that?" And I say, of course it's true. Every word. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a bit of time for questions and answers and discussion. Can't see who's out there. Perhaps if the writers could come and sit down. I think we will all fit onto the settees. It is nice
cozy,
and
yeah.
cozy, and I hope the audience is just as cozy as we are. And we just wanted to open up the floor a little bit and have a chat about short stories and walls, and Chris's wonderful writing. And perhaps I could kick off by asking you, Chris, something about that wall between genres, so between autobiography and fiction, because
the story was reflecting on its own telling. Of course, we don't know that any of that is true. How productive is that tension between autobiography and fiction? How strong is that dividing wall?
I think it's, I guess in terms of the story, I tend to think of the story just as its own thing. I mean, it is the most autobiographical story in the collection, and I was having a great deal of trouble finishing it. So the sort of, that breaking of the fourth wall, or the sort of, the telling about the telling that happens at the end was really a function of me having a conversation. That conversation I describe with the lawyer, and when I reread it, I'm always surprised that it's always like mentioned in one line, because that was such a big thing at the time, and I thought about it so much, and it always feels like, to me, it's a much larger section of the story. But it was just this other perspective on what happened and my way of thinking about it that I really wanted to include. Really, the only way to include it was to sort of step outside and talk about that whole, the non-story shapedness of life, because I think that's a very interesting problem to encounter. Whenever you try, I think lots of stories start with an autobiographical element, but the more you revise them, the more you get into the story, it's somewhere along the line it seems to become its own thing. It somehow transmutes, and then you're dealing with a different matter, and also it can affect your memory of what really happened. There's another story in the collection called The Crossing, which is about this couple who kind of had a terrible walking holiday in the West Country, and it's, in terms of geography and where they go, it's heavily based on a holiday I took with my wife, and she's like, I love that holiday. Boy, you can really turn into a psychodrama. So it can reflect both ways, I think. Fiction can change, the truth of autobiography, the way autobiography can inform fiction.
Yes, I think I'd be horrified to know that, well, that couldn't have really happened to you because of the terrible CDS. Yeah, so, I think someone else. Yeah.
That story is just another side of hand, because you said, we have to construct stories, and we have to always take stuff out, and they're sort of artificial, aren't they? Because we just take it out of them. And then you list the things that you've taken out of yours, and then they become part of the story. And they have kind of like an important and significant part of the story. So that's an amazing side of hand, because of course the story in the end is not really about what happened, it's about writing a story. I thought that was really interesting.
Question up there.
Thank you. Just a question for anyone that wants to answer it, just about responding to a theme or a trigger of any kind. So much part of the short story writer's life is to respond to either to calls or to opportunities or themes. I'm just interested to hear if anybody on the panel particularly enjoys the challenge of having to respond to something in particular, or if so, what is it that you enjoy about that process, rather than just coming up with something off no trigger or just something from the mind.
It's interesting you say stories that come from no triggers, because I think all stories come from a trigger, but I know what you mean, that some of them are sort of internal, accidental triggers, and some of them are external. And I certainly know that if I'm responding to a call or a theme or something, rather than trying to force something, I take my dog for a walk, and I let ideas about where that theme could go sort of emerge as I'm walking around and pacing, and usually they stem from then a central image that can then the story can be built around. And sometimes that central image is left out because the story doesn't need it anymore. So it's very much an organic process that moves through all those stages of sort of mulling ideas over and seeing what comes up, and then starting to write and then going to the editorial stage. And I think acknowledging that and trusting it is a really important enter into writing thinking, I have to have a fully formed idea before we start writing, we can feel very frustrated if we don't have that fully formed idea straight away. So there's a tip for the students out there: trust yourself to just keep working away at it and see what comes in.
Yeah, I was just going to add a slightly different thought, that I tend to just write some daft idea that comes into my head, but I haven't published a new story for maybe 2 years. And when this came up, write a story about a wall, it forced me to have to write a story. And so I wrote a story about a wall, and rubbish started to write another story about a wall, and that didn't work out. But the third time, I wrote a story that was all right, because I had to write a story about a wall, and there was a date, and I wrote it very close to that date. So I think that does work for if you do have, well, you're just too busy, there's no such thing as writer's block, in my opinion. But what we do quite a lot with the students, I think, is if you've got to write something now, and it's about this, or it's inspired by that, to do this exercise, or use this particular trigger, then it makes you write. And when I found plenty of excuses for a couple of years not to. It's the first time I've ever written a story to order.
I just wanted to add that I find it really great to be given something to write about. Not because I don't write all the time or don't have ideas about what to write, but because having to write about something different sometimes makes me think about the form more. So if I feel, if there's something I'm sort of emotionally compelled to write about, the writing isn't always as adventurous or as experimental as it might be, for instance, in war. And some of my preoccupations, current preoccupations are in there, such as, for instance, the English Midlands, which is where I'm from West Midlands, and the idea of a no place and nowhere, and ideas about memories of the place where you grew up. Andrew, you edited an anthology, The Red Room, to do with the Brontes. So how do you feel about having to write about something?
Well, I slightly cheated, or I cheated quite a lot, because this, as John sort of gave the game away at the beginning, and it says in the biography in the book that this story had previously been published, so I didn't write a new piece in response to Wall. But I did try and start something, but I find that you can't really force it, and I think if I did start something but the idea wasn't working and I couldn't make it work, so I decided to just put it to one side. It just wasn't happening. But I did find a story that I thought fit with the theme quite well, so that's why that one went into this. But as an editor, I understand, that other writers also struggle with this, because there were people that I did approach for Red Room and asked them to write in response to the Brontes, either inspired by their work or their own personal lives. And some of them just couldn't do it. So it's something you can't really force. In my own collection, I've got stories in there that are in response to paintings or a photograph, and that just kind of happened naturally, but it's not something you can really control, I don't think, to try and make something fit to an idea. So
In response to what I absolutely love it. I think it focuses the mind, and I think the mind's a very clever thing, so you end up writing about what you want to write about anyway, and I think it facilitates that. So, maybe the theme of war, but by the end of that process I will have come out with something I did want to write about, and whether it connects loosely to the theme of war, or it doesn't matter because you've produced a piece of work. So for me, I love it. I'm lazy as well, and coming up with new ideas isn't easy. And so somebody gives me the idea, war. There you go.
Actually, I think it was you who thought of the idea of war. but for me, actually, it just really very much depends on whether or not it chimes with my my own, abiding interests. For instance, when Andrea wrote to me and asked me to contribute something to Red for me, especially Wuthering Heights, is just a continuing inspiration. I'm especially keen on Wuthering Heights. I love the complex structure of that, and I think it really affects my writing. And I grew up on Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, so that was easy. But quite often I see, adverts for the themed anthologies, and it just doesn't chime for me. So I think it very much is to do with whether or not it, chimes with your own interests. For me, anyway.
Chris, you.
I think I've probably given some of his writing styles there because it makes you write something that's more like to be original than if you write in your usual style or genre. For instance, I write a lot about place, and for this story, I didn't do that. I did have a go at trying to do that with different walls in different places, and it didn't really work out. And I think the first idea you get is not usually the best idea. The first few ideas are probably what other people try to write about as well. And a great one for that is stewing back on my mind for a few weeks and see what comes out. And it's usually something completely unexpected. And the character of that one just came out of, well, I don't know, there is some personal experience in it. But I just think, it can, make you write something completely different to what you would normally write.
Chris, do you want to say anything about writing commissions or?
Sure.
Yeah.
I have to now, so the armour of the microphone approached me like an anxiety.
Or you can ask a question.
Yeah, I guess, my book's called Mothers, and some people are sort of, I don't know, puzzled by that. Some people aren't. It depends. It's obviously it's a powerful word, I think. It always conjures up like an immediate response. It's one of those words that everyone sort of has an opinion of sorts on. But that certainly only occurred to me, when I viewed all the stories, 10 of them together, it seemed like 7 of them had mothers in them, where it's about being the child of a mother. But it's sometimes quite, explicit, sometimes implicit. But I certainly never thought of that. I never thought I was writing a collection about mothers, and on an individual basis, I've only sort of worked out the themes of some stories, weeks or months after I've written them. And I think I've never actually written to a theme. It sounds wonderful. I'd definitely like to be able to do it. I don't know if I would be able to do it, but I think what Philippa said was really important too, about how, certainly for me, it's about just sort of getting an image down on the page, or writing one scene that seems to, possibilities seem to grow out of that. So it's only in retrospect that I sort of realise, the story was about that, or maybe I meant that. And I like the up for grabsness of that as well. I like the fact that another reader can come along and say your story is about something completely different to what you latterly decided it was about.
Okay, so I think we're actually up to 4 o'clock now, aren't we? Yeah. So maybe there's time for just one more quick question from us, our select audience.
When collaborating for an anthology, do you find that your writing influence each other at all, or did you just come together at the end with your finished pieces?
Anybody want to answer that?
I just think something immediately I thought of is that both in this anthology and a reading at a conference last week, there seems to be some sort of mysterious shared consciousness, because Billy and I wrote, it's not actually the same thing changing, the same story without speaking, without knowing what we were going to do, and my preoccupation was about mothers and dying parents, and Billy had written that same subject in order to write a story about a wall. And the
Actually, Mothers was a...
Yeah. And Mothers, and at the time we didn't know that Chris was going to be
We
here.
didn't know Chris was going to be here. So both wrote stories about mothers.
And on Friday, I'd written a story about, well, I'd read this story about dying parents, and there were 5 readers, 3 of whom wrote about parents who died, and there was a symbolic object that they were seeking that would explain the relationship with the person that died, and 2 had written about relationships that ended. The woman at the end of the relationship responded by having an erotic shower by herself. And this is people had written, it was not mine, mine was one of the death stories. So without knowing how or why, there seems to be some sort of shared consciousness that if you ask 5 people to write about something, that somehow there'll be an odd connection.
We didn't really collaborate though. We didn't.
No, we didn't.
We didn't speak about what each of us would write about. Yeah, we share. Once we'd written the first draft, then we shared the stories, and I suppose helped each other edit the stories. I think that's gave feedback on the stories. So that's how we collaborated. Yeah. There were comments I remember from, was it you, John? There's no wall. I think you need to mention the word wall. We had a very long email exchange about should the word wall, does the word wall need to be in everyone's story?
There's also about wallpaper, but not wall.
And I was very much, no, wall doesn't need to be mentioned in everyone's story. Of course it doesn't. You know, a metaphorical, symbolic wall, you know, maybe we should be able to read what the wall is in that way, but
it's quite hard not to mention wall, actually, when you deliberately try not to put it in.
I didn't have wall in mine, and even though I thought it doesn't need to have the word wall in it, I was quite adamant about that. I ended up putting the word wall anyway, so maybe I was trying to placate John or something. Yeah.
I was trying to placate you.
Any other comments? No. There is a bookstall outside, and I think we can hang around just a little bit longer. So I think I just need to say thank you very much to all our readers today. Thank you to Festival Ideas and Eyes, and to the ever helpful, wonderful staff at the Arts Centre. Thanks to Jamie Smith for his wonderful cover for the wall, and thanks especially to Chris for joining us today. So thank you.